What if I told you there was a NASCAR mechanic who looked at a block of common household wax and saw a championship? Not a candle, not a floor polish, not a birthday cake decoration. A race-winning secret hidden in plain sight, stuffed inside an engine that would pass every inspection NASCAR threw at it, then transform into something completely different once the green flag dropped. We're talking about a scheme so simple it sounds like a joke, so effective it won races at the highest level of American motorsport, and so audacious that when officials finally unraveled it, the room went completely silent. Not from anger. From stunned, reluctant admiration. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the mechanical wizardry, the backroom genius, and the absolute nerve it took to bend the rules in NASCAR's golden era. If you're someone who loves the untold engineering stories behind racing's greatest moments, the garage secrets that never made the highlight reel, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. So let's set the scene properly, because the context here matters enormously. It's February 20th, 1983. Richmond Fairgrounds Raceway. The Miller High Life 500. Richard Petty, the king himself, wheels his famous number 43 STP Pontiac into victory lane after absolutely dominating the field. 207 of 400 laps led. The crowd is electric. 7 championships, nearly 2 decades of dominance, and here's the king still finding ways to win. His 198th career victory. The stuff of legend. But something small, almost imperceptible, catches the eye of a sharp NASCAR technical official during post-race inspection. The left side tires look slightly wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not obviously wrong. Just a hair oversized, like someone put just a touch too much air in them, or maybe selected a tire that measured just a fraction of an inch larger than the rulebook allowed. It's the kind of thing 99 officials out of 100 would wave off as within tolerance. But this particular official kept looking, and that tiny moment of curiosity would unravel one of the most creative, most brazen, and most technically brilliant cheating schemes in the entire history of professional motorsport. Here's the thing. The tire irregularity wasn't even the real story. It was the thread that, when pulled, unraveled the sweater. What investigators would eventually find underneath was the work of Maurice Petty, Richard's brother, engine builder extraordinaire, and apparently a man with a profound understanding of both thermodynamics and audacity. What Maurice had done was look at NASCAR's engine displacement rules, look at basic high school chemistry, and connect 2 dots that nobody else had thought to connect. Or if they had thought of it, nobody had the nerve to actually try it. Now, you might be thinking, okay, engines, displacement rules, wax. What does any of that actually mean? Look, let me break this down so it's crystal clear, because the elegance of what Maurice did only hits you once you understand the machinery involved. NASCAR's Winston Cup Series in the early 1980s had a strict engine displacement limit. 358 cubic inches. Not 359. Not 360. Exactly 358. Displacement is essentially the total volume swept by all the pistons inside an engine during one complete cycle. Think of it like the engine's lung capacity. Bigger lungs, more air, more fuel, more combustion, more power. Every team wanted more cubic inches. The rules said they couldn't have them. So the competition came down to who could extract the most power from an identical volume. Engineers spent millions trying to squeeze every last horsepower from 358 cubic inches. The pre-race inspection process was straightforward. Officials would use a pump to measure each cylinder's volume with the engine cold, at bottom dead center. They'd fill each cylinder with fluid, measure the volume precisely, add up all 8 cylinders, and arrive at a total displacement figure. If it came in over 358, the car was disqualified before it ever turned a competitive lap. No exceptions. No appeals on race day. You're done. Here's what most people don't realize about that inspection process. The measurement was taken cold. Room temperature. An engine sitting in the garage, not yet warmed up, not yet running. And that detail, that one seemingly insignificant operational reality, was the crack in the wall that Maurice Petty drove a Pontiac right through. Paraffin wax, the same stuff used in candles, has a melting point of roughly 120 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the specific grade. A NASCAR engine at operating temperature runs its coolant at around 180 to 220 degrees Fahrenheit. The combustion chambers themselves get dramatically hotter than that. So if you pack a precisely measured amount of solid wax into the combustion chambers before inspection, the wax takes up physical space. It displaces fluid. The inspector's measurement comes back showing a smaller engine than what's actually there once the wax is gone. The engine passes at 358 cubic inches. The car rolls to the grid. The green flag drops. The engine warms up. 15 laps in, the wax has completely melted, been atomized through combustion, and been expelled through the exhaust system in microscopic invisible droplet. And suddenly Richard Petty is driving what effectively measures as a 373 cubic inch engine, while every competitor is stuck at 358. 15 cubic inches. You might be rolling your eyes right now. 15 cubic inches sounds like nothing. Like the difference between a large coffee and a large coffee with a tiny splash more. But here's where it gets really interesting, because in NASCAR terms, that gap was a canyon. The general engineering principle in that era held that each additional cubic inch of displacement was worth approximately 2 horsepower at peak output. That math gives you somewhere between 25 and 30 extra horsepower from Maurice's wax scheme. And 25 to 30 horsepower in a racing series where teams spent entire seasons chasing 5 horsepower gains wasn't a small advantage. It was a weapon. Consider the numbers from another angle. A legal, well-built 358 cubic inch NASCAR engine of that period was producing somewhere around 620 to 625 horsepower on a good day. The wax-enhanced 373 was pushing 648 to 655. That's not just more peak power on the straightaways. The increased displacement fattened the entire torque curve. More pull coming off corners. More drive in traffic. Better top-end velocity without having to rev the engine to the absolute limit. Richard Petty could use driving techniques that simply weren't available to his competitors, because his car physically responded differently. And nobody could figure out why. Junior Johnson, himself a legend of creative rule interpretation, admitted years later that he knew something was happening with the Petty cars during that period. His exact quote, pulled from a 1997 interview, cuts right to it. That number 43 would come alive around lap 20, he said. We tore our engines apart trying to find what they had. Never found it because we were looking for mechanical solutions. The idea that they were using something that disappeared never crossed our mind. That's the genius of it. Everyone was searching for a hidden component, a secret part, a modified piece of hardware. There was nothing to find, because the evidence burned away at operating temperature. The preparation required was extraordinary. Maurice wasn't just slopping wax into cylinders and hoping for the best. The process was surgical. First, the wax selection. Standard candle paraffin wasn't suitable, because cheaper grades leave carbon deposits when burned. They needed a pharmaceutical-grade paraffin with a very specific melt point, high enough to stay completely solid during the cool garage environment of inspection, low enough to liquefy within the first 10 to 15 laps of racing. Too high a melt point and the engine might run half a race before fully clearing, creating inconsistent power delivery that drivers and spotters would notice something was off. Too low and the wax might begin softening during an unusually warm pre-race staging area, potentially alerting sharp-eyed officials to an unusual combustion chamber reading. The installation technique was an art form developed through extensive private testing. The wax had to be warmed just enough to become pliable without liquefying, then pressed carefully into each combustion chamber by hand, conforming perfectly to every contour of the chamber shape, filling every valve pocket and recess without leaving air void. Air voids would affect the measurement inconsistently, creating readings that varied between cylinders and raised red flags. The chambers all needed to read within NASCAR's acceptable tolerance of each other. If one cylinder measured noticeably different from the others, officials might probe further. After installation, the wax had to cool and fully harden before the engine was assembled. Then it had to survive transportation to the track, qualifying sessions where the engine would fire briefly but not reach full operating temperature if they were careful about how long they ran it, and the entire pre-race period. They were essentially smuggling a time-delayed modification through inspection in plain sight. The camshaft profile is where the engineering sophistication really reveals itself. Maurice understood that a 373 cubic inch engine has different optimal parameters than a 358. Different air-to-fuel requirements, different ignition timing curves, different exhaust scavenging characteristics. You can't just add displacement and expect everything else to stay optimal. So the camshaft was ground to a profile that would perform adequately at 358 cubic inches during warm-up but really come into its own at 373. This meant the engine was actually slightly suboptimal during qualifying and the opening laps of the race. It was giving up a small amount of performance before the wax cleared. But once it transformed, the cam profile, the carburetor jetting, the ignition timing were all dialed for the larger displacement. The engine was built for what it would become, not what it appeared to be. The carburetor was jetted on the rich side of normal for a 358, which inspectors might notice but could write off as a conservative fuel strategy for engine longevity. In reality, that extra fuel was what the engine demanded once 373 cubic inches came fully online. The exhaust headers were tuned for the larger displacement, meaning their scavenging efficiency was optimized for airflow volumes that a legal engine couldn't generate. On a flow bench testing a standard 358, these headers might look slightly mismatched. But nobody was flow bench testing exhaust headers for compliance. Not in 1983. The dynamometer testing they conducted at the Petty shops in Level Cross, North Carolina, produced remarkable data once they had the system dialed in. The power curve would literally shift during a simulated race cycle. Cold startup, around 605 to 610 horsepower. 5 minutes into a hot run, 630. 10 minutes in, 641. 15 minutes, once the wax had fully cleared and the engine was operating as designed, a consistent 650 to 655 horsepower. You could watch the power meter climb on the dyno as if the engine was waking up. Because it was. Now, you might be thinking about the risk involved in actually running this in competition. What if the wax didn't fully clear? What if a chunk of partially melted paraffin got past a valve at speed? The potential for catastrophic engine failure was real. A piece of solid wax the size of a pencil eraser caught between a valve and its seat at 9,000 revolutions per minute would be devastating. But Maurice had thought this through. The wax was installed specifically in the combustion chamber space above the piston crown, and the grade selected ensured it began softening almost immediately at operating temperature. By the time the engine reached the thermal stress zone where valve float and high RPM events became critical, the wax was already liquid. The physics worked in their favor. Liquid paraffin at that temperature and pressure environment atomizes almost instantly when introduced to the combustion cycle. It doesn't pool, doesn't accumulate, doesn't damage valve seat. It simply vanishes. The 1983 season opened with Richmond, and the wax-enhanced engine performed exactly as designed. Richard Petty dominated. Led 207 laps. One going away. Post-race inspection was routine, focused on the obvious stuff: weight, body templates, height measurement. Nobody pulled the engine. Nobody checked displacement on a hot motor. The scheme worked perfectly on its first major competitive deployment, and the Petty team likely celebrated with the quiet satisfaction of people who have just gotten away with something extraordinary. But look, let's be honest about something important here. The tire irregularity that eventually triggered the deeper investigation wasn't connected to the wax scheme strategically. It was a separate piece of creative compliance. Petty Enterprises was running slightly oversized left-side tires, a trick that helped the car handle the oval's banking differently, improving cornering speeds on left turns without violating ride height rules in any measurable way. This kind of layered approach to rule bending was standard practice at top teams. You didn't rely on one trick. You stacked marginal gains wherever you could find them, because any individual gain might be caught, but collectively they added up to race-winning advantages. The problem with stacking tricks is that if one thread gets pulled, it can unravel multiple others. Dick Beattie, NASCAR's technical director at the time, had been paying particularly close attention to Petty's cars. The consistent dominance, the mysterious mid-race power surge that other teams reported observing, the fact that cars with similar qualifying speeds would inexplicably fall behind the 43 after 20 or 30 laps. These weren't random observations. They were data points accumulating in Beattie's mind. When he noticed the left-side tire discrepancy at Richmond, he didn't treat it as an isolated minor infraction. He treated it as probable cause. The inspection that followed was unlike anything NASCAR had conducted in recent memory. This wasn't a template check and a weight measurement. They disassembled the engine. Completely. Every component removed, measured, photographed, and documented. Bore diameter, stroke, connecting rod length, compression height of the pistons, and then the combustion chamber volumes, measured with the precision instruments that a full teardown allowed rather than the simpler pumped method used at pre-race tech. The displacement came back at 373 cubic inches, 15 inches over the legal limit, in an engine that had passed pre-race inspection at 358. The room went quiet. Maurice's initial response was measured, as you'd expect from someone who'd had time to prepare for this possibility. Measurement error was suggested. Thermal expansion was raised as a possible explanation, the theory being that an engine run at extreme temperatures for hours might show dimensional changes that a cold measurement wouldn't capture. These weren't completely absurd arguments. Thermal expansion is real. Measurement equipment does have tolerances. But NASCAR wasn't buying it, and here's why. Because when they examined the combustion chambers with a borescope, they found something that blew every alternative explanation apart. Microscopic traces of waxy residue, concentrated specifically in the valve pockets and chamber recesses, the exact areas where a craftsman would have pressed solid wax to maximize volume displacement. Not carbon buildup, not oil residue, paraffin, the fingerprint of genius. Bill France Jr. flew down personally from Daytona to handle the situation. This wasn't a bureaucratic decision. This was the ruler of NASCAR's universe sitting across a table from the sport's most iconic family, trying to balance justice against diplomacy. Richard Petty was not some anonymous rule-bender from a small regional team. He was the sport's biggest draw, its public face, its connection to decades of heritage. You couldn't handle this quietly, because too many people already knew something had happened. But you also couldn't nuke the Petty family publicly without damaging the sport itself. The resolution landed somewhere in the complicated middle. Petty Enterprises was fined $35,000, which in 1983 dollars represented a genuinely significant financial penalty, equivalent to roughly $100,000 today. Richard was docked 104 championship points, a number substantial enough to affect title contention. He kept the Richmond victory, which created its own controversy, since the performance advantage that helped win the race was deemed illegal. Maurice received a suspension covering the remainder of the Richmond race situation and the following event at Rockingham. The sanctions were real. They were also clearly calibrated to stop well short of threatening Petty's continued participation in the sport. Here's what most people don't realize about the aftermath. The fine and the suspensions, significant as they were actually the less impactful consequences. The lasting damage was to NASCAR's complacency. Beatty and France immediately began redesigning the technical inspection process from the ground up. Random post-race engine displacement checks became standard procedure, with NASCAR officials selecting cars for teardown inspection without announcing criteria in advance. Engines were required to be checked at operating temperature in addition to cold measurements, specifically to prevent any scheme that relied on temperature differential between inspection and competition conditions. The wax trick had forced NASCAR to evolve, and that evolution changed the competitive landscape for every team on the circuit for years afterward. The reaction from the broader racing community was deeply divided and deeply fascinating. Smokey Yunick, the legendary mechanic whose own list of creative compliance experiments could fill its own video, called the wax scheme brilliant without qualification. His exact words in a later interview were characteristically blunt. "Maurice had guts the size of watermelons," he said. "I thought about temperature-based tricks, but I figured NASCAR would catch on immediately. He was smarter about hiding it than I would have been." Coming from Smokey Yunick, that praise meant something. Other crew chiefs expressed admiration mixed with frustration. The consensus in the garage was that the creativity was undeniable, but that getting caught created tighter restrictions for everyone. When one team finds an exploit and uses it successfully, the entire field benefits from that performance edge remaining available, even if most aren't using it. Once NASCAR closes the loophole, everyone loses access. From that perspective, the wax scheme's exposure hurt the competitive flexibility of teams that hadn't even known it existed. Internationally, the motorsport world watched with genuine fascination. Formula One engineers, accustomed to their own labyrinthine technical regulations and the creative compliance games played within them, were struck by the mechanical elegance of the solution. The simplicity was what impressed them most. Formula One cheating of that era tended toward exotic materials, complex hidden systems, sophisticated electronic workarounds. The idea of using something as mundane as paraffin wax to gain a measurable displacement advantage was almost insultingly straightforward. And that was precisely its genius. Let's zoom out for a moment, because the wax trick didn't happen in a vacuum. The early 1980s in NASCAR were what historians of the sport now call the Wild West era of technical innovation, and that description barely captures the reality. This was a period when teams were acid-dipping body panels to reduce metal thickness and shave weight that scales couldn't easily detect. Hydraulic suspension systems were being built that would actively lower the car's ride height at speed to reduce aerodynamic drag, then raise back to legal height when the car slowed. Fuel additives that skirted the line between performance enhancement and outright illegal compounds were common enough that NASCAR's fuel testing protocols were primitive by the standards needed to catch them. Some teams were running carburetor spacers with hidden internal channels that altered airflow in ways that standard flow testing wouldn't identify. The Petty organization wasn't uniquely corrupt in this environment. They were playing the same game as everyone else, perhaps with more sophistication than most. What made the wax scheme exceptional wasn't its immorality within the context of the era. It was its cleverness. Most of the tricks being run in that period were mechanical, static, fixed modifications that either passed inspection or didn't. The wax was dynamic. It changed during the race. It was the only piece of equipment on the car that was fundamentally different at the finish than it had been at the start, and by the time anyone thought to check for it, it was gone. Understanding what this meant technically requires appreciating how combustion chamber geometry affects engine performance. A combustion chamber isn't just a space where explosion happens. Its shape determines how the flame front propagates, how completely the fuel-air mixture burns, how much residual heat is retained, and how effectively exhaust gases are expelled. Engineers spend enormous effort optimizing combustion chamber geometry for specific displacement target. When Maurice added wax volume to the chambers, he was temporarily altering that geometry, but in ways that actually worked in his favor during the inspection phase without significantly harming performance during the wax-clearing transition period. This is where it gets really interesting from a pure engineering standpoint. The wax, as it began to melt during the first laps of the race, would produce a very brief period of slightly elevated fuel density in the combustion mixture as the liquefying paraffin entered the combustion process. Paraffin has a reasonable calorific value, meaning it releases energy when it burns. For perhaps 10 to 12 laps, the engine was effectively getting a tiny supplemental fuel source from the melting wax itself. This would have been barely measurable in any individual combustion event, but across thousands of combustion events over 15 laps, it contributed a marginal additional energy input that no fuel sample test would ever capture, because by the time anyone might test anything, the wax was completely gone. The torque numbers are worth dwelling on specifically. Peak horsepower gets all the attention in casual racing conversation, but torque is what wins races on oval track. Torque is what pushes the car forward when the driver gets back on the throttle coming off a corner. It's what determines how aggressively a driver can apply power without breaking traction. The 373 cubic inch effective displacement was generating approximately 520 pound-feet of torque compared to around 495 for a legal 358. That 25 pound-feet difference sounds modest in isolation. In context, it meant Richard Petty could get back on the throttle earlier and harder than his competitors exiting every corner on every lap. Multiplied across hundreds of laps, that compounded into lap times that were consistently and inexplicably faster than cars with nominally similar power output. Other drivers noticed but couldn't articulate what they were experiencing. Cale Yarborough, one of the era's fiercest competitors, reportedly told his crew chief after a race where Petty had dominated that he felt like he was driving against a different class of car. Not a faster car in any specific way he could point to. Just a car that seemed to have more in reserve everywhere: corner exit, straightaway, traffic navigation. That description is a nearly perfect characterization of what a significant torque advantage feels like from behind the wheel of a competing car. Now, the ethical dimension here is genuinely complicated, and I think it's worth engaging with honestly rather than just dismissing the scheme as straightforwardly wrong. Racing has always existed in a moral gray zone around rule interpretation. Every serious motorsport team interprets regulations in its own favor wherever language is ambiguous. The rules say the displacement must be 358 cubic inches. They don't specify at what temperature that measurement must be taken, because before Maurice Petty, nobody thought to specify it. Was exploiting that omission cheating? By the outcome, yes. When you design a system specifically to produce a different measurement at inspection than during competition, you're deceiving the regulatory body. That's cheating by any reasonable definition. But here's the thing. The moral framework of the racing garage has never fully aligned with civilian ethics, and pretending otherwise misunderstands both. In the garage culture of NASCAR's formative decades, the philosophy was explicit. If the rule doesn't prohibit it specifically, it permits it implicitly. The obligation was to race as fast as legally achievable, and the definition of legal was whatever you could demonstrate compliance with at inspection. This wasn't secret or unusual. It was the openly stated operating principle of virtually every top team. Smokey Yunick built his entire reputation on it. Junior Johnson made it an art form. Maurice Petty refined it to a level nobody else approached. The broader question of whether this kind of creative compliance ultimately helps or hurts the sport is one racing historians still debate. The argument for its value runs as follows. Innovation emerges from constraint. When rules create limits, the most creative engineering minds find ways around those limits, and sometimes those innovations have broader applicability. The solutions developed in pursuit of racing advantage have contributed to production car technology in many documented instances. The pursuit of cheating-proof inspection processes forced NASCAR to develop measurement standards and protocols that improved technical consistency across the entire field, benefiting legitimate competitors as much as anyone. The argument against is simpler and more intuitive. Cheating undermines competition. When some teams have access to performance advantages unavailable to others, race results stop reflecting actual performance quality and start reflecting the sophistication of rule evasion. Sponsors, fans, and participants all invest based on the assumption that outcomes are determined by skill and legitimate engineering within defined constraints. When that assumption is violated, trust erodes. And trust, once eroded, is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. Both arguments contain truth. What's certain is that the wax engine incident sat at the intersection of both realities. It was creative genius that forced genuine improvements in how NASCAR operated while simultaneously representing a clear violation of the principles of fair competition that give racing its meaning. Let me tell you about what happened to Maurice Petty's reputation in the years that followed, because it's more nuanced than you might expect. The immediate aftermath of the scandal placed him in an uncomfortable spotlight. The Petty family name carried enormous weight in NASCAR, and having that name attached to a cheating scandal, however admirably creative, created genuine tension within the community that had celebrated them for decades. Richard managed the public narrative with characteristic diplomacy, maintaining that he simply drove what was built and that engine preparation was Maurice's domain. Whether that represented genuine ignorance or carefully constructed plausible deniability is a question only the brothers could answer. Maurice himself retreated into silence on the specific details. In later interviews, he never explicitly confirmed or denied the wax scheme's mechanics. He acknowledged the penalty and the measurement discrepancy with a kind of diplomatic vagueness, attributing it to aggressive rule interpretation rather than deliberate deception. His smile when the subject came up, described consistently by journalists who interviewed him across the following decades, told a different story than his carefully chosen word. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly what he'd done and had made peace with it. Within the engine-building community, his reputation actually grew after the incident, which probably says something important about that particular world. Engine builders respected the technical sophistication required to execute the scheme properly. The wax selection, the application precision, the integration with every other engine parameter, the months of private dynamometer development. These weren't the actions of someone cutting corners carelessly. This was methodical, expert-level work applied to a creative solution. Other engine builders who had dedicated their careers to squeezing power from conventional approaches found themselves quietly impressed by the unconventional thinking, even as they publicly maintained appropriate positions about fair play. The Petty Enterprises shop in Level Cross became something of a pilgrimage destination for young engineers and mechanics trying to absorb the culture of creative innovation that the facility represented. The physical space itself was unremarkable, a working race shop with the organized chaos of serious motorsport operations everywhere. But the people who came through those doors in the late 1970s and early 1980s absorbed something harder to quantify than technical knowledge. They absorbed a problem-solving philosophy that refused to accept conventional thinking as the endpoint. If the obvious solution doesn't work or doesn't give you sufficient advantage, keep looking. The answer might be in an unexpected place. Richard Petty's 200th career win, which came later in 1984, occurred under much stricter scrutiny. NASCAR officials were watching the Petty operation with particular attention following Richmond. The inspection process around the 43 car had become notably more rigorous than the field average. In some respects, the wax incident had made Petty's continued winning more impressive, because whatever advantages might previously have contributed to results were now unavailable. The King kept winning on driving skill and legitimate mechanical excellence, which arguably demonstrated that his dominance was never solely dependent on the extra cubic inches. Here's what most people don't realize about the lasting structural impact of the wax scheme on NASCAR's technical framework. Dick Beaty's post-incident redesign of inspection procedures wasn't just about adding displacement check. It triggered a comprehensive review of every element of the technical inspection process with one guiding question applied to each element. Is there any physical or chemical means by which a car could pass this check at a given moment while being out of compliance during competition? That question reframed everything. It shifted the inspection philosophy from static compliance verification to dynamic integrity assurance. The difference sounds subtle but was profound in practice. Random post-race teardowns became frequent enough that teams couldn't rely on the assumption that no post-race engine inspection would occur. The uncertainty itself was a deterrent. If you knew there was a 30% chance your engine would be disassembled in victory lane, the risk calculation for elaborate in-race deceptions changed dramatically. The wax scheme worked partly because the probability of a hot displacement check was effectively zero in early 1983. Once that probability became non-trivial, the scheme's risk-reward profile collapsed. Engine sealing procedures were introduced, where inspection officials would mark specific engine components before qualifying and verify those marks before and after races, ensuring engines weren't being changed between sessions. This closed off another category of potential manipulation, the possibility of running a legal engine for inspection and substituting a different unit for the race. The wax trick hadn't specifically involved engine swapping, but the sealing procedures addressed that potential exploit simultaneously. The fuel sampling and testing protocols were strengthened as a separate but related initiative. If NASCAR was tightening every other area of technical compliance, it made no sense to leave fuel testing as a relatively unsophisticated outlier. New chemical analysis equipment was purchased and specific testing procedures were standardized across all inspection facilities. Teams running exotic fuel additives found their window closing at the same time teams running displacement tricks lost their opportunities. All of this represents a genuine, lasting, measurable improvement to NASCAR's technical governance. And it exists directly because Maurice Petty looked at a block of paraffin and saw a race-winning secret. The irony that cheating improved the integrity of the sport is not lost on historians of the era. The technology gap between 1983 and today makes the wax scheme seem almost quaint, but that's a misreading of its significance. Modern NASCAR Cup Series engines are remarkable machines, purpose-built to incredibly tight specifications with tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch. They operate under surveillance that would have seemed like science fiction to Maurice Petty. Electronic sensors monitor temperature, pressure, and vibration in real time throughout a race. Post-race teardowns are conducted with equipment capable of detecting material variations at microscopic scale. The probability of successfully executing a temperature-dependent displacement scheme today is effectively zero, not because the physics have changed but because the detection capability has evolved far beyond what the trick requires to remain hidden. But here's the thing about framing the wax scheme as simply primitive by modern standards. That framing misses the entire point. Innovations aren't judged against the capabilities of future detection technology. They're judged against the environment in which they operated. In 1983, with the inspection tools and protocols then available, Maurice Petty built a scheme that was effectively undetectable. That he was ultimately caught came down to a cascading sequence of unrelated observations, an observant official noticing a tire, a broader investigation triggered, microscopic wax residue found only because they were looking for something to find. Without the tire observation, the wax scheme might have continued operating undetected for years. Consider the competitive mathematics of extended successful operation. If the wax trick contributed meaningfully to results across 2 full seasons, conservatively estimating modest power advantages translating to 5 or 6 additional wins or significant points bonuses over that period, the financial and competitive return vastly outweighed any eventual penalty. The $35,000 fine and 104-point penalty were the cost of doing business against potential season-changing gains. This wasn't reckless gambling. It was calculated risk management executed with reasonable sophistication. The human stories behind mechanical scandals are always more interesting than the technical details alone, and the wax engine incident has human dimensions that the official record barely captures. Think about the crew member who was responsible for wax installation before each race where the scheme was deployed. This person carried an extraordinary burden of specific knowledge. They knew exactly what was hidden inside that engine. They handled the installation personally, pressing wax into combustion chambers with the care of someone who understood that too much or too little could blow the entire operation. They sat through inspection watching officials pump test fluid into cylinders over the very cavities they'd packed with paraffin the previous night. And they maintained complete silence afterward, even as the investigation unfolded. That silence held. Despite multiple investigations and decades of subsequent interest from journalists and historians, the specific mechanics of the scheme were never confirmed by anyone directly involved. Maurice took the core details with him when he passed in 2020. Richard maintained his diplomatic distance from the engine preparation specifics until his own retirement from detailed public engagement with the topic. The crew members who would have had direct knowledge either genuinely didn't understand the full picture of what they were contributing to, which is plausible given how compartmentalized professional racing operations tend to be, or they honored an unspoken code that has deep roots in garage culture. You don't talk about what happens in the shop. The competitive response from other teams during the period when the scheme was actively operating is worth examining for what it reveals about how unusual the power delivery pattern was. Dale Earnhardt's crew reported back to Kirk Shelmerdine after races against Petty during that period that the 43 car seemed to gain power rather than lose it as races progressed. Most cars shed marginal performance across a long race as engines accumulated heat stress, fuel delivery became slightly less optimal, and minor mechanical wear accumulated. The expectation was that a car's performance window would be highest in the opening laps and gradually diminish, with drivers managing to maintain position through strategy and skill. A car getting stronger after 20 laps was genuinely anomalous. The Earnhardt camp correctly identified the observation but couldn't explain it. Bobby Allison's operation had similar reports. After the 1983 season opener, Allison himself told journalists that the Petty car appeared to have found something the rest of the field hadn't. He phrased it carefully, avoiding direct accusation, but the observation was pointed. Coming from a competitor with Allison's experience and technical sophistication, it carried weight. These weren't uninformed complaints from frustrated losers. They were technically grounded observations from people who understood exactly what their own cars were doing and recognized that the 43's behavior pattern fell outside normal parameters. NASCAR's investigation, once triggered by the tire observation, moved quickly. The organization had developed enough institutional knowledge of creative compliance by 1983 that investigators knew what categories of questions to ask. The combustion chamber volume discrepancy was identified rapidly. The wax residue discovery was the forensic confirmation that transformed a measurement anomaly into documented intent. The paper trail of the investigation is part of NASCAR's historical records, though the complete technical documentation has never been fully released publicly. What has emerged through Freedom of Information requests and historical research confirms the basic outline that became public knowledge at the time. The philosophical legacy of the wax engine incident extends into conversations happening in engineering schools and business schools today, which is perhaps the most unexpected dimension of the story. A scheme executed by a self-taught mechanic in a small North Carolina race shop using material available at any hardware store is now taught as a case study in problem framing, constraint management, and the relationship between creativity and ethical boundaries. The specific technical details matter less in those educational contexts than the underlying mental model Maurice employed. He identified a fixed assumption in the inspection system that measurement conditions were static, when in fact there was a variable he could manipulate: temperature. He found a material that interacted with that variable in a precisely controllable way. He engineered the implementation to minimize detectability, and he accepted a defined risk profile that he calculated was acceptable given the potential upside. That's not a description of cheating. That's a description of analytical problem-solving applied without ethical guardrails. The removal of those guardrails is what made it cheating. The underlying cognitive process is indistinguishable from legitimate innovation. Business strategists have written about the incident in the context of competitive analysis and regulatory arbitrage. The principle that rules create boundaries and boundaries create advantages for whoever most accurately understands where the boundary actually sits rather than where convention assumes it sits is directly applicable to industries far beyond motorsport. Tax strategy, financial regulation compliance, pharmaceutical patent navigation, technology platform policy interpretation. The same cognitive framework Maurice applied to NASCAR displacement rules is applied daily in boardrooms with far larger stakes and far fewer spectators. The specific physics of what a 373 cubic inch engine experienced compared to a 358 during an extended race provides a final technical dimension worth understanding. Over a 500-mile race at Richmond's short track, where gear changes and corner exit acceleration events number in the thousands rather than the hundreds of a superspeedway, the torque advantage compounds dramatically. Researchers who've modeled this scenario using period-accurate engine data estimate that the displacement advantage was worth between 3 and 5 seconds of lap time over the full race distance, accounting for how the advantage manifested in corner exit and traffic management situations rather than pure straightaway speed. 3 to 5 seconds in a 500-mile NASCAR race of that era would typically represent a margin of multiple finishing positions, the difference between winning and running 5th or 6th. This wasn't a marginal tweak providing a tie-breaking advantage. It was a significant performance gap masquerading as superior driving and preparation. The scheme was winning races that would otherwise have been won by competitors. Understanding that magnitude helps explain both why the Petty organization deployed it and why NASCAR reacted with the combination of significant penalty and comprehensive procedural reform that followed. Maurice Petty's contribution to racing history is irreducibly complex. He was one of the finest engine builders of his era by any objective technical measure, a craftsman whose legitimate innovations in combustion chamber design, valve train geometry, and exhaust tuning contributed to the Petty organization's success across decades independent of any rule-bending. He was also the architect of one of the sport's most audacious attempts to game the competitive system. Both things are simultaneously true, and the temptation to let one overwhelm the other in assessing his legacy should be resisted. The wax engine story endures because it touches something fundamental about human competition. The drive to win is not neatly contained by rule books and inspection processes. It flows around them, through them, seeking any available path to the checkered flag. Sometimes that flow produces legitimate innovation. Sometimes it produces creative fraud. The line between them is often thinner than comfortable, and the people who walk closest to that line are frequently the most interesting people in any competitive field. What happened at Richmond in February 1983 was simple and complicated simultaneously. A man put wax in an engine. The engine grew during a race. A championship team got caught, penalized, and continued. NASCAR got better at inspection. The sport moved forward, and the story of paraffin and pistons became part of racing's permanent mythology, told in garages and engineering classrooms, a reminder that the most powerful innovations sometimes arrive in the most ordinary packages. If you've made it this far, you already know you're exactly the kind of person who belongs in this community. Drop in the comments below what you think. Was Maurice Petty a cheat or a genius? Was the penalty appropriate or was it too lenient given the scale of the advantage? And what other golden-era NASCAR engineering stories do you want us to dig into next? Because there are more of them. Many more. And some of them make the wax engine look conservative by comparison. Subscribe, hit that thumbs up, and we'll see you in the next one.